Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. I'm here with Mr. Peroni. It's a pleasure to have you back on the show. We've had numerous conversations about the Natalie Wood's death and your investigative work into her death, where you came up with some very interesting and important conclusions or just matters that might have been overlooked by the investigation. But do you mind introducing yourself again for the audience out there that might be new to you?
Well, Robbie, first of all, I appreciate very much you asking me back on your show. I always enjoy visiting with you. And my name is Sam Perroni. I'm the author of a book called Brainstorm, an investigation of the mysterious death of film star Natalie Wood. And I'm also a lawyer who handled white collar crime criminal defense work primarily for about 30 years before I retired. And then before that, I was a federal prosecuting attorney for 5.5 years. And I prosecuted numerous types of criminal cases in the federal arena.
Now, when did you become aware of Natalie Wood's death? And is that when you started investigating it? I'm sure you must have heard of it on the news, but when did you start looking into this thing? Was it like 5 years ago you started investigating this thing seriously?
Well, no, I'll tell you, Robbie, this year it'll be 10 years ago when I decided I was going to investigate Natalie Wood's death. Well, here's how I learned about it. I was sitting in a car with a friend of mine getting ready to go to court when the news came on the radio. And I'll tell you, I'd always been a longtime fan of Natalie Wood. I think I first recognized her when I was about 11 years old. We're within one day of being 10 years apart in birth. She was born in 1938 and I was born in 1948. So by the time I recognized her, she was probably about 19, 20 years old, something like that, maybe. And for the only way to put it is I just basically fell in love with this lady. And so I followed her over the years. I wasn't like an obsessive fan or anything like that. I mean, I think I saw most of her movies, but probably not all of her movies. And but when I heard about her death, I mean, it really affected me. It affected me like I felt when I heard about John F. Kennedy being assassinated. It was the same kind of feeling. And of course, I listened to what the news reported, and it sounded fishy to me. And being a former prosecutor and criminal defense attorney, but what was I going to do about it? I was in Little Rock, Arkansas, and this happened out in the waters off of Catalina. So what was I going to do about it? So it wasn't until 2015, after I retired, that I read something about Natalie Wood's death, and I just closed it up and went to my wife and said, "You know what I'm going to do?" And she said, "Well, what's that?" And I said, "I'm going to investigate Natalie Wood's death." Just like if I were a prosecutor trying to gather evidence to prosecute a crime. And that's what I did over the next, I'm still investigating Natalie's death for all intents and purposes, but it was intensive for probably about 6 years. And then my book was published in 2021.
Now, we've covered in previous episodes, kind of the first episode we talked about who was Natalie Wood, and then a little bit about her death. The second one looked more at the actual trip that they took with Robert Wagner and Christopher Walken and Dennis DeVerne. And then third one we did, I think we talked more about documentation and kind of cover up aspects that happen to relate with connections to Frank Sinatra. Sheriff Peter Pitches is a name that also came up in that conversation, and also extra witnesses. But through all of this, what sources or where did you know to look when it came to opening up the file on Natalie Wood and getting more down to like the autopsy stuff, the things that I would say probably when you were taking this seriously, there was what Lana Wood's book out, and then maybe a couple other sources. But if you look up Natalie Wood's death and hit books, there's only like three or four. There's not main media press documentaries about it. I think there's like two documentaries, but even they're more telling the story, not necessarily getting into the hard, different things, more about just how the disappearance and the drowning happens.
Well, first of all, anyone that's really interested in Natalie's death, who really doesn't know that much about it, needs to be very careful about going on the internet and reading newspaper articles or magazine articles. And the reason for that is the people that wrote them were not investigators. For all intents and purposes, all they did was gather in newspapers and magazines and pull information from those newspapers and magazines and write their story. They really didn't have very many, if any, firsthand interviews with key witnesses or look at documents that were pertinent to the case, those kind of things. So you have to be very careful about reading some things, because I'll tell you right now, there's a lot of information in magazine articles and newspapers that is wrong. And so the best way to look into it, if you're really serious about it, is to try to get firsthand information. So here's what I did to investigate Natalie Wood's death. And this is what I've always complained about as far as the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department is concerned. They have allegedly investigated Natalie Wood's death 2 times. The first time in 1981, which I contend was a massive cover-up and not really an investigation. They called it an investigation, but it wasn't an investigation. And the second one was in 2011, where it was a very inconsistent approach to it. It was kind of like the higher ups wanted to do it for an ulterior motive, which we could get into, or the actual investigators were serious about it. They were trying to gather evidence. They were just going about it the wrong way. And here's the right way. If you have an unexplained death, which Natalie Wood's death was, it was an unexplained death. Her body was found floating in the water. They determined that she drowned in salt water. It's unexplained how she got there and what happened to her to get there. So if you're an investigator, the very first thing that you would do is, number one, you would look at the forensics. You would actually study the autopsy report and see what the forensics saw and noted. That's number one. But number two, the most important thing as far as gathering evidence would be to determine motive. Who would have a motive to kill Natalie Wood? That would be the big question, because for any investigator, the cardinal rule, and all the investigators that I've ever met that investigated death cases, all of them will tell you this. The cardinal rule for every one of them is you assume that the death was a homicide until established otherwise. Okay? So that means when you go into it with the idea that somebody killed this person. And then as you develop evidence, if it turns out it was an accident or a suicide or something like that, then that's the conclusion that you reach. But you go into it believing it was a homicide. So if you believe it's a homicide, then the first question you've got to ask yourself is, who would have a motive to kill this person? And that was never done by these investigators, either in 1981, which of course they didn't want to, and in 2011. It was like they had some kind of gigantic metal block that prevented them from looking into the motive issues in the case. Well, when I started investigating it, the very first thing I did was start looking into the motive evidence. And if you like, I can tell you about some of the specifics that I went and looked for.
I do want to hear about the specifics, but I know it's going to lead to some of the arguments and things that were recorded by witnesses at like restaurants. And then also one, I think it was a bar or restaurant that was also in the isthmus or near the isthmus before where they were traveling. So I'm curious, how did you know to look up names or try and find anybody in the area specific to being able to get witness statements? Because if you watch, there's a documentary out, forgetting what the name is called, but they interview the guy who found her in the water, buoyed up with her red or pink jacket. But they interview him, and he says that her body was just floating there, and explain some things. But these are things where like they talk about the little dinghy didn't look like it had been even turned on. Like it kind of looked like it could have just been floated away from the yacht. I mean, these are important witness statements that I'm always curious how someone can go and try and find. Like for you, finding information that Robert Wagner and Natalie Wood had a blow up in, I believe it's North Carolina was where it was at one of those restaurants.
Well, first of all, you are exactly right. Um, there were four people. There was the boat captain, Dennis DeVerne. There was Christopher Walken, the actor. Now, keep in mind now, this is 1981. So Christopher Walken, even though he just won an Academy Award, he wasn't a household name. People didn't really know who he was, other than the fact that he was with Robert Wagner and Natalie Wood, who everybody knew. Okay. So then you have Robert Wagner, Natalie's husband, and you have Natalie. And they were at a restaurant, the only restaurant in the area where the boat was moored, their yacht, the Splendor. It was the only one. This was a very desolate area. There wasn't a motel or they didn't have shops to go shopping in, that kind of thing. I think they had a little convenience store where people could go buy milk and stuff like that who lived in that area. But this is a very desolate area. This is for people who wanted to get away from things, who wanted to go to a quiet place on the island and secluded place. So they went to the restaurant, and then they people observed things that were very pertinent. And then they left the restaurant and went back to the yacht. And this all happened around 10:30, 11 o'clock at night. And that's when the statements of Marilyn Wayne and John Payne become very important. But back to the restaurant. The other thing that you would do if you were an investigator is if you knew that this case was investigated before, which it was when I started in 2011, it had been investigated twice. What you do is you try to gather in the police reports. Well, of course, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department didn't want to have anything to do with helping Sam Perroni investigate Natalie Wood's death. So I had to sue him. As a matter of fact, I think I sued him 2 times, maybe 3 times, to get records and information. And I was very successful. I didn't get everything that I wanted, but I got hundreds of documents, which, whoops,
What did you want that you didn't get?
okay. I wanted the autopsy photos, and I wanted the photos, any photos that were taken of Natalie on the scene. I wanted to see, I wanted to see, number one, how she was dressed. I wanted to see if the jacket was zipped up or unzipped, the red down jacket that she had on. And I wanted to see if there was anything observable just by looking at her where she had any bruises, cuts, scrapes, or scratches. I wanted to see the autopsy photographs, not for sensationalism. I wanted to see those because I wanted to give them to my forensic expert, my forensic pathology expert, so that they could look at any bruises, scrapes, or scratches she had on her body so they could decide for themselves whether they thought they occurred after she was in the water or before she went into the water. There were also statements that were taken by the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, including a statement from Christopher Walken in 2011 that I wanted, which the judge wouldn't give me anything out of the 2011 file. He gave me everything out of the 1981 file except the autopsy photos.
Did you think that was suspicious that the 2011 file was the one the judge was blocking you on? Do you think it could have had more revealing or private information because it might have been so many years after the fact?
Well, they claimed they interviewed 100 people, and I don't believe a whole lot that the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department says, but let's assume that it's correct. Then I wanted to see who they interviewed, and I wanted to see what they say the people said. I also wanted to see whether the statements were signed or sworn statements. Like, for example, Christopher Walken, who I believe is the key to determining the real truth in this case, in Natalie's case. I wanted to see if they took a sworn statement from him, that is, put him under oath, where he could be subject to penalties of prosecution if he lied, or if they just took notes and just did a memo on what he told them. They say my information is he voluntarily agreed to go in and give another statement in 2011, but I don't know that to be the case. But I wanted to see those kind of things, Robbie, because they're important. It's important to know whether a witness's statements are just a memorandum, or if they're handwritten. Sometimes they have statements write out things themselves. Witnesses write out their statements themselves. So I wanted to look at that, and here was the frustrating part about it. The frustrating part about it was the judge, even though the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Office said the investigation was ongoing. Now, keep in mind, I started this in 2015. They supposedly reopened the case in 2011. The judge held, and there's a court order, he held after looking at the evidence that he didn't believe that there was an ongoing investigation. They were telling the media and everybody else it was ongoing, but it was obvious that it wasn't ongoing. So that was basically their defense to my claims for wanting this information. And I believed under the law that I was entitled to the information. And the judge ruled that based on the California Freedom of Information Act, there was one section there that I wasn't entitled to it because it was investigative material and investigative of a crime, which I was contending they really weren't investigating it as a crime. But anyway.
If you got the autopsy photos, could you use those? Because all we use right now is the autopsy report. And it has the drawing of the body, and then there's like scrapes, and they mark cuts and bruises on the legs on the figure in the report. But you could look at the photographs and tell if they were types of scrapes and bruises like what they said, which was from banging against rocks, compared to something that might have been more physical abuse.
Right. Well, I want you to know, I want all your listeners to know something, Robbie. Natalie was found floating in the ocean, not floating up against the shore. As far as anyone knows, her body never hit the shore or any rocks. So that's number one, okay? And there was nothing in the water, no debris or other boats that she could bang into, anything like that. So all the bruises and scrapes and scratches she had were more than likely sustained before she went in the water and perhaps while she was in the water next to the dinghy. And, we could go, I think I've gone into that before, but anyway, there's some specifics there. But here's the thing about the photographs that is really important. When they take photographs, autopsy photographs, they don't just take a picture of an entire body where you see maybe a bruise, at a distance of 5 feet or 10 feet. They zero in right on these injuries and they take a picture of the injury. And see, that's what I wanted. I wanted that. Plus, they took skin tissue from some of these bruises that were on her body. By the way, there were 32 bruises on her body. That were documented. They took some skin tissue and they looked at that skin tissue through this powerful microscope that they have to determine whether or not the bruise was a recent bruise or an old bruise, or whether or not it was a contusion, which, to have a contusion, you have to have force. Or if it was just a regular old bruise where somebody bumped into something. When they did that, those microscopes have cameras on them, and they can take photographs of the skin tissue, which I wanted. As far as the record is concerned, those things are still preserved. They're still in the coroner's office. Those slides and possibly any pictures that they took with the slides. And as far as I know, they gave most of it or all of it, copies there of them, to the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, and they would have been in the 1981 file.
Can you tell from a photograph if that little mark on her throat, that was like a fingernail mark? Could you tell if you looked at that if that was something that was done from like a more hostile point of view, if we talk about getting into an aggressive fight?
Robbie, there was a scratch noted on a document in the autopsy file in the middle of her throat. And the answer to that question is yes. If you zoom in on it, a pathologist could look at it and say that scratch was likely caused by a fingernail. All right. They can do that. And of course, it would also depend on whether or not a close-up was taken. If a close-up photograph of that scratch was taken, which I believe there was, then you could really tell from a closer examination of it what kind of scratch it was.
Now, whose fingernails did they not check under when everything was said and done and they had found Natalie's body? They didn't check under Robert Wagner's, right? Or Christopher Walken's?
They didn't check anything. And when I took Dr. Noguchi's deposition under oath, he actually recoiled when I asked him if he took fingernail clippings and scrapings from under Natalie Wood's fingernails. He actually recoiled at it when I asked him the question, and he said no. Now, that was standard operation procedure. So you got to ask yourself, why would this famous big-time pathologist not take fingernail clippings and scrapings from Natalie Wood's body? Secondly, even though there's a claim a couple of claims that people might be able to find in documentation that Wagner, Davern, and Christopher Walken were examined um, by the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. They weren't. There was absolutely no examination that was conducted of Wagner, Davern, or Walken. None. Nobody looked under their fingernails. Nobody took scrapings or clippings. Nobody looked at them to see if they had any bruises or scratches on themselves. Nothing. Ever. There wasn't even a request for it as far as I could find.
What questions did you ask Noguchi besides about the fingernail part? Did you ask him why he chose certain pathologists that happen to deal with more things you would find probably in assault cases, like strangulation experts? I think Noguchi was the bruising expert, if I'm not mistaken.
Um, Yeah, he was. He was supposedly the bruise expert in the office. His specialty was being able to look at scratches and scrapes and bruises and be able to basically determine a timeline of when they were made and also who made them. But uh, people have to understand something. When I was taking Noguchi's deposition, he was being represented by the same people who were representing the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. These folks didn't want me to have information, and the deposition was in a Freedom of Information Act case. So I was basically limited, for the most part, to questions concerning Freedom of Information Act issues. So I wasn't able to basically ask him the kind of questions that I would ask him if I took his deposition in Natalie Wood's death case and started in on him on why he used particular pathologists and so forth and so on. But the circumstantial evidence is pretty clear. Dr. Noguchi or somebody suspected that Natalie Wood had been grabbed by the throat because of that scratch in the midline of her throat. And so two other pathologists in the office who were specialists in strangulation and chokehold death were called in to examine the interior of Natalie Wood's throat to see if there was any damage on the interior. There wasn't any damage on the interior, but that doesn't prove that she wasn't grabbed by the throat. Because if you kill somebody, the likelihood is you're going to damage the interior of the throat if you choke them to death. But Natalie Wood wasn't choked to death. She drowned in salt water. But as far as the um, pathologists were concerned, they didn't know that. The other thing that was found, though, was blood spots on Natalie's lungs. And nobody but me has ever mentioned this. But if you do any medical research on these, they're called Tardo spots because the pathologist, Dr. Tardo, 100 years ago, came up with a theory that if you see these spots on people's eyes, around their eyes, then the likelihood is they were strangled to death. But the research also showed that if you found spots on the lungs, there was a substantial likelihood that they occurred while the person was screaming or yelling. And see, the captain, Dennis Davern, said that there was a screaming, banging, cussing fight between Natalie and Robert Wagner on the back of the Splendor before she disappeared. So those spots corroborate the fact that there was a screaming, banging fight. Because in my opinion, they wouldn't have been there had that not happened.
Have you tried contacting Noguchi after you had him for the deposition? Have you tried emailing or just giving a phone call to him to see if he would maybe give you some information off the record?
Well, it's interesting. You asked some great questions, Robbie. It's interesting you should ask that question because immediately after I took Dr. Noguchi's deposition, he moved to Japan. And as far as I know, he was living in Japan until maybe a couple of 2 or 3 years ago. He's about he's pretty close to 98, 99 years old right now. Maybe even 100. But he's still living. But my understanding is he's living in the Southern California area. I don't know that for a fact, and I don't have any way to contact him. So the answer to your question is no, I didn't try to. Well, yes, I did try to contact him after his deposition, but he was gone. He was in Japan, and I haven't tried to contact him since. But between all of us, I wouldn't believe anything Dr. Noguchi told me.
Why is that?
Because Dr. Noguchi intentionally did things to disregard evidence of a homicide and intentionally did not do things that could have established a homicide in his autopsy of Natalie Wood. In my opinion, he was helping cover up a homicide and concluded it was an accident with no information to support it.
I know Noguchi from the RFK case, so I try and hold out a little hope for him. I found his LinkedIn and sent him a message, but never heard back. But out of another witness that you could have thought to talk to was Dennis DeVerne. Now, I spoke with DeVerne on the phone, and we had about a 30-minute conversation, and he mentioned things like Natalie Wood, and I think all of them spit like a Quaalude. I don't know what it was exactly, he specific drug he mentioned, but he mentioned that everyone took one and that there was all this going on. And then he ended up, after the incident happened, he moved into Robert Wagner's guest house or behind his place. I asked him about that, and he seemed very apologetic to like the whole situation of back and forth testimony and stuff like that. But I think his latest statements about that Robert Wagner had him say certain things is where he still stands. But then he recommended that I speak to Martin Ruley, who I don't really know. I had like a one interaction with email. And he was like, I'm not going to say anymore until she gives you the okay. And to me, that's very strange. Now, I get it if you said something in a book and you have to sign a paper or something so it doesn't mess up book sales or you're an obligation, but you're a part of a mysterious death case. I feel like just being open and honest when someone comes to you with questions, you would want to be transparent and just tell them, hey, this is what happened. This is my recollection of it. I mean, the whole drug thing he mentioned, I had never heard of until after that. I talked to you about it and you had mentioned something, and then you sent pictures inside the Splendor of like just how the setup was. So with Dennis DeVerne, did you ever reach out to him? And then maybe we can talk about some of the you have to go through this person before I can speak to you type deal.
Well, the answer to the question is absolutely yes. I tried to talk to him before my book was published, and Marty Ruley, the lady that wrote the book with him, she uh, 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 contacted me, basically said she didn't want to have anything to do with me or anything I was doing because she knew everything about it, and she was the total source of information, and I couldn't do or establish anything. But nobody would let me talk to Davern, and he wouldn't talk to me without their permission. Plus, they had an agent. So you got to keep this in mind about Dennis DeVerne and Marty Ruley. their primary goal in all of this was trying to make money. And Marty Rooley was caught on a television show, um, basically saying that they were withholding information so that she and DeVerne could make billions. Okay, she uses the word billions with a B, and their whole thing has been to make money. That's why they got an agent. Dennis DeVerne doesn't talk to anyone unless you pay him, and neither does Marty Rooley.
Which again is crazy because, like, for me, I spoke with him on the phone. Everything sounded really genuine. I think we talked for like 45 minutes. I think he was on his way to do something, drop a boat in or do something. He lives in Florida, which is on the East Coast with me. We're a good few hours apart from each other. But I didn't get the sense that he wanted money. But then it was until the Marty Ruley stuff came up, and then that he wasn't going to speak to me, and then eventually it was becoming like no. And that's the thing, is that you can't really trust his statements then. He's kind of like Marina Oswald in the JFK case. She flipped every which way. So when it came to Thomas Noguchi and Dennis DeVerne, one person who does the autopsy and handles the forensic findings, and one person who was there that could, yes, give you hearsay statements about what happened on that boat, or what he experienced, or what had been the course of action with the back and forth testimonies or changing statements later on. Who do you look at next? You have to look at the witnesses that you have, which is John Payne and Marilyn Wayne. Now, those witnesses, where did you hear their story? When did that come onto your radar? And when did you decide to go find them?
Well, here's what happened with John Payne and Marilyn Wayne. And by the way, Marilyn Wayne's 8-year-old son was also on the yacht. Um, Initially, what happened was both of them independently contacted the sheriff's office right after they heard the screams and cries for help the night before. And when they found out that Natalie Wood had been found dead in the ocean, so they called the sheriff's office. Well, the sheriff's office didn't call them back, and they left messages. And when I obtained the documents, I discovered these messages. So initially, the information I had was what was reported in a few newspaper articles about Marilyn Wayne's statements to the press. But the sheriff's office at the time discounted it. As a matter of fact, the lead detective told the newspaper that he thought that she was just somebody trying to get her name in the newspaper. When I obtained the files, the 1981 files of the sheriff's department, I discovered handwritten notes by the lead detective's crime scene investigator, Mr. Hamilton, where he talked on the telephone with both John Payne and Marilyn Wayne. And it was independent, and they both told basically, not identically, of course, but basically the same story about what they heard the night before Natalie Wood's body was found. So you got to keep in mind with those two, they basically told the press that they were liars, for lack of a better word. And so when I was investigating the case and I saw that, one of the first people that I had on my list to go talk to was Marilyn Wayne. And I went and found her. And although she hadn't really talked to anyone for years about what happened, when she realized that I was interested in the investigation of the case and not money, And I want everybody to keep in mind that before my book was ever published, I said I didn't want to make a penny off of Natalie Wood's death, and I haven't. I have given everything that I've made off of my book to charity in Natalie's memory. And I'm going to continue doing that. But she was very helpful to me, and eventually ended up giving a filmed interview, which we have posted on YouTube. So I don't want people to take my word for this. You go to YouTube and you look up Marilyn Wayne and you listen to her and watch her and see what you think about whether or not you believe she's believable. And keep in mind when you're watching it that her fiance at the time, John Payne, corroborated what she said to the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, both in 1991 and in 2011. But he wouldn't talk to me. He wouldn't talk to me for my book. Don't ask me why he wouldn't talk to me. He just said he gave all the information to the Sheriff's Department, and that was it. I guess he really just doesn't want to be, involved with it anymore. But there's no way to keep him uninvolved because he was with Marilyn Wayne at the time all this happened.
Why would people deny that they're actual witnesses? I mean, their boat, you have pictures of their boat, you have pictures of them. At least I think it's just John. I have a picture of John Payne, I think you sent me. And then also the boat, the Capricorn. And then you can look at the photos of the isthmus where they parked their boat and everything like that. It's all like everything's moored right beside each other, basically. There might be a good distance apart just because you're judging from a photo, but it's a relatively small cove like area. So, them hearing somebody scream, help, 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 and then someone saying, I'm coming, hold on, we're coming to get you, and then the silence stops. It's not an unbelievable story. It's actually probably most likely very accurate. And they just went to bed. I mean, that would be incriminating themselves if they admitted that to police, if they were lying. Why wouldn't they just be like, oh, they said they got her, something like that. So obviously there's criticisms that you'll find in anything. But what are some criticisms that come up with them as witnesses? Just people that don't want to believe that Wagner could have done something or Christopher Walken could have been a part of a cover up?
Well, very few people have commented on this video. And by the way, we've had almost 180,000 views. Very few people have commented that they didn't believe her. And most of those people are people who are Robert Wagner fans. They just, no matter what, they just do not want to accept that Robert Wagner would have anything to do with Natalie Wood's death. And that's really, for the most part, what the issue is, because when they make comments about not believing her, they really don't say why. They talk about Robert Wagner and so forth and so on, but they don't really say why they don't believe Marilyn.
Taking I'm about to say, taking it back to the motive evidence, you've mentioned before, we just mentioned earlier about talking about the occurrences of people seeing Robert Wagner and Natalie Wood fighting. But we also have the friends that made statements in documentaries that talked about they were invited to go that Thanksgiving weekend, but they didn't want to go because they didn't want to be around Robert Wagner and Natalie Wood because they were fighting all the time, or Christopher Walken and Robert Wagner because they were fighting all the time.
Yeah, right. No, there's plenty of evidence out there to show that there was hostilities between Robert Wagner and Christopher Walken before they ever went on that trip to Catalina Island. And I might add, for people that are sitting there thinking now, why in the world would they agree to go on a trip to Catalina Island together with Natalie if they were fighting all the time? Well, the answer to the question was, when this thing was planned by Natalie, she wanted Christopher Walken to see their yacht and go with them on a little trip. But they also asked other people, and the other people couldn't go because of Thanksgiving commitments, or in the case of a very, very close friend, said, well, I didn't want to go because Robert Wagner and Christopher Walken were fighting all the time. And that is a statement that was made on camera in the recent documentary that was produced by Natasha, Natalie Wood's daughter. So if anybody disputes what I'm saying, just watch it and you'll see the man make the statement.
I think even with the second investigation, what I saw in the documentary was that the guy mentioned that having this boat captain move into your backyard was suspicious. Mostly like, because obviously Dennis DeVerne could be interviewed by however many people that just want to talk to him about this tragic death. But I mean, do you find that suspicious that he moved Dennis DeVerne behind in his little guest house and had him kind of close to him for a while after the incident? I mean, he didn't care to leave Natalie there for Dennis DeVerne to identify the body. He left with Christopher Walken on a helicopter. So obviously it didn't seem like he might have been super upset. Maybe that's why he left. But that is a very strange thing to do. And I think that raised a lot of red flags for a lot of people.
There's a big difference between something just being suspicious, okay, where you basically speculate about something, and something being a part of a chain of evidence, which could be classified as circumstantial evidence, where you could draw an inference from it, which people do every day in their lives. That's what I've always said about Natalie Wood's death investigation. It's a circumstantial evidence case. It's not like somebody having a video showing someone shooting someone. Uh, Most cases that are taken to court are circumstantial evidence cases because you don't have an eyewitness every time a crime happens. But it is suspicious. Number one, that the yacht was moved from Avalon, the biggest populated area on the island, where there's a lot of boats and a lot of people, to the most desolate area on the island in the isthmus. And as a matter of fact, it's still fairly desolate if anybody ever would like to go there to see it. So that's number one. And then number two, the circumstances after Natalie Wood's body was found is just beyond bizarre. It's not just suspicious. It's like it's so it's so telling, in my opinion, as to the ultimate question that it's not even debatable. And things like you mentioned, where Robert Wagner, when he was asked by the sheriff's department to identify Natalie's body, he sent the boat captain, Dennis DeVerne. And then he left with Christopher Walken on in the sheriff's helicopter and flew over to the mainland, where they interviewed him for 6 minutes. Things like that. It's beyond suspicious.
And also, you have the detective's notes of Christopher Walken one day where he states this kind of big, angry fight that was going on. And then immediately 3 days later, when he lawyers up, his statements change. Or is it the day later that his statements change? You have those notes, and it shows that the language was changed to sound less. Or no, his statement changing was that he went to go look for Natalie. And really, he said he was sleeping the whole time or something of that sort, right?
Yeah, that's right. I have the handwritten notes that were taken by both investigators. Now, people need to keep in mind, if they're doing it properly, when there's a death investigation, there are two investigators generally. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but there are two. And so in this case, there were two, and both of them were taking notes independently, and yet the notes track each other. So when you see that, you can feel pretty confident that that's exactly what somebody said. With Christopher Walken, he initially on the mainland told the sheriff's department that they went looking for Natalie. And then in his second interview, after he lawyered up, he was asleep when it happened. He went to bed after they got back to the yacht, and he went to sleep, and he didn't wake up until the next morning when all the police investigators were swarming around the yacht. That was his statement. It's very, very inconsistent, and I can tell you, I've said it before, Christopher Walken lied. He lied to the sheriff's department, and he knows a whole lot more than he has ever said publicly about what happened that night.
What separates your book and your investigation into Natalie Wood's death compared to Lana Wood and Marty Ruley's? I mean, you attacked this from a more criminal or just prosecutor type scenario. You're looking at this at legal matters. You're looking at evidence. You're laying out for people different types of evidence when it comes to circumstantial, and when you're looking at things for like applying motive. Their books really don't do that. I mean, Lana Wood's book kind of dives into the whole background with the tensions, the relationships, how she knew her sister, what her sister wouldn't do, which is important. But you handle this from just like an actual case perspective, which is how the investigation should have been done, which is just examining things and picking up where other so-called investigations did not do.
Well, that is the big difference, Robbie. And I don't want to be unduly critical of these people, but you have to keep in mind that, and this is true just about in every book that you pick up. People try to sensationalize their books to sell books. So a lot of them are juiced, if you understand what I'm saying. They're juiced. The people put things in them that are not really true, that are sensational, so they can sell more books. That's number one. Number two, people are not trained in investigating criminal cases. And I've been a lawyer for over 50 years, and I spent 40 years of it doing nothing but prosecuting and defending criminal cases. So you learn a lot during that period of time about investigations, and the book authors that have written about Natalie, they're not trained investigators. They don't know really how to look for evidence. So a lot of the book is just sensational statements, like Lana Wood's book. I mean, she talks about Kirk Douglas raping Natalie. That might be interesting to people. I think it's kind of sad. I think it's probably true, but I don't know what it has to do with Natalie Wood's death.
Now, you do also look and examine Sheriff Peter Pitches in your book. And I will say for anybody out there listening, your book is very documented evidence-wise. I kind of have to read it over a couple of times to make sure I'm soaking up the information that's actually in it, but you do provide pictures, documents, and things in the book for people to be able to see your evidence as well, too. Nothing's just based on this was said. It's here's what was said. Exactly. Here's the thing for it. But I have to ask, when it comes to the connection with Frank Sinatra, few people would understand the relationship that people had that were in high positions of power in Hollywood, what they could and could not get away with. And let me tell you, the could not list is a lot shorter than the could list. Frank Sinatra was a powerhouse figure. His name still gets mentioned, much like Marilyn Monroe's gets mentioned today. But he covered up a lot of scandals as well, too. I want to know when you looked at the Sheriff Peter pitches and you look at those connections that he like with Frank Sinatra or just anything on that Hollywood level scale that happens to do with Robert Wagner and Christopher Walken. Is that enough evidence, or is that something that is an underlooked aspect and why they were not questioned long enough, why they were not put under tests or certain things or brought into court to testify, and how could they just be let go to free to go over a woman dying and being pulled out of the water and they're able to leave on a helicopter? The only thing I can think of is just their status in Hollywood or Robert Wagner's at the time. And don't get me wrong, Natalie Wood was bigger, but Wagner was still a figure that had been in some movies. He had a name there established in Hollywood.
Yes, Robbie, it really is very important for people to understand. This was 44 years ago. And 44 years ago, Hollywood had certain powerhouses, people that basically controlled the entertainment industry. Unfortunately, a lot of it was mob related. These were underworld figures that had been involved in the entertainment business going back to the 20s and 30s, when they were basically the sponsors for singers and other people who wanted to get into the business. And the way they got into the business was performing at clubs that were owned by the mob. So if the mobsters let a entertainer perform in their place, it was basically one of those kind of things where the entertainer now owed the mobster, and the mobster controlled the entertainer. And of course, people were afraid of him. Now, when it came to Frank Sinatra, I know there's a whole lot of Frank Sinatra fans out there, and one of them that I came in contact with not too long ago was just so disappointed when he read my book, because this guy was his father had actually met Frank Sinatra. He was from I think it was Wisconsin, maybe Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And he was just this big Frank Sinatra fan. But when he read my book and saw what I wrote in there about Frank Sinatra and his connections to the mob and how he treated people, he was just, he was, he was very upset. Okay. But it was true. It's true.
Well, yeah, the mob kidnapped Frank Sinatra's son, and there was like held for like a ransom or something of that sort too. He knew he had mob figure friends. He's part of the Rat Pack.
Listen, there was all sorts of stuff like that going on, and the mob had its hand in Hollywood, and it was still a forceful hand back in 1981. And Frank Sinatra was reputed, whether anybody wants to believe it or not, Frank Sinatra was, and there was substantial evidence of it, buddies with these gangsters, particularly a fellow by the name of Sam Giancana, who was the head of the mob in Chicago. And Frank would golfing with the guy and had him to his casino in Lake Tahoe, where Frank got in trouble and got barred from the casino business for 25 years. So when Frank Sinatra, here's what I put in my book, and here's what I believe in all my heart. Frank Sinatra, when Natalie died, Frank Sinatra was very close to Natalie. It's reported, and I believe it, that they had an affair after Natalie divorced from Wagner, and maybe even before that time, when Natalie was very young. He was very fond of her. He liked Natalie a lot. When Natalie married Wagner, he was also liked Wagner. And so when Natalie's body was found, and all of a sudden here's this big spectacle, his natural inclination would be to contact Wagner and say, "What the hell happened?" Well, Wagner told him his story, and Frank wanted to believe that story. And so Frank, in my opinion, set about by contacting his buddy, Sheriff Peter Pitches, and they were buddies. And I have sworn testimony from Sheriff Pitches in the hearing that was held over Frank Sinatra's ability to participate in casinos in Las Vegas. Sworn testimony where Pitches says they were very, very close friends. And part of it is quoted in my book. They were very close friends. So it doesn't stretch credulity to accept the fact that when all this happened, Frank Sinatra didn't contact Robert Wagner and Frank Sinatra didn't contact the sheriff. He also went after Dr. Noguchi when Dr. Noguchi made a couple of comments that would have been derogatory towards Natalie. And it got him fired in the process. And this is all in my book too. So there was that aspect of this case back in 1981. Basically, leave it alone.
There's
what you need to do to make it look like you've done something, and then stop, move on. Don't do anything that would make Robert Wagner look bad.
I believe to quote Frank Sinatra in his letter is that Dr. Noguchi needs to be seen, not heard.
That's it. Needs to be seen, not heard. That he basically was talking too much.
Which, again, with Noguchi, it's complicated because I think he did a great job on the autopsy of RFK. And JFK and RFK are like the two subjects I focus on a lot. But his statements you see with Natalie Wood, he's a completely different person. It seems like calling yourself corner of the stars might get to your head and you start making some ramblings and untrue statements to glorify or to hyperbolize the death of someone, which I believe is what got him in trouble with Sinatra. But Sinatra, there's a famous FBI wiretap you can see of Sam Giancana talking about Frank Sinatra because he gave money to him to give to RFK so they could have the mob, or RFK could not attack the mob anymore, or at least certain figures, because he was going after the mob hard back in like the 60s. So he mentions Frank Sinatra and calls him a bastard and everything. It's on the FBI website. You can see that. That's why I find it so weird, because these recent batch of JFK and RFK records, most of the RFK ones, I think I've sent you one already, was about Sheriff Peter Pitch's name comes up for the LAPD because RFK was killed in California. So you have this whole connection there. And it was interesting because there's rumors that RFK was going, from a couple of witnesses, was going to a party after he won and made his speech and everything. And he was meeting with Frank Sinatra. Now, whether I know that's true, I don't know. I've just seen it said in multiple statements. So again, there's this weird aspect of someone with very, very important political, pop culture reputation that is also influential in other aspects, like a Howard Hughes. That dude was involved in so much. So you get into these aspects of that sounds too far-fetched to believe. It's really not. It was just a different time. You know, the time we're in right now is completely different back then. In different cases, I mean, there's still probably some influential figures that do some corrupt stuff, but it was a different Hollywood. It was a different world, kind of, in the way that we viewed popularity, the way that we viewed actors and actresses. That's why there's so many people that care about Natalie Wood because they idolized her. So many people that care about Frank Sinatra because they idolize him. You know, again, looking at this case like how you just followed the documentation and the evidence, and you followed statements, and you looked and said that some of this stuff is inconsistent with the official narrative here. And that's what I appreciate about all the talks that we've had and we've done on the case as well. And I appreciate the many years that you have focused into this and uncovering certain things that are important to the case. Again, I know you have done some legal aspects with this when it came to having like Noguchi deposition, just stuff like that, and looking for files. What about the ones you have listed on your website that are cases, like actual court recordings? What are those exactly that you have detailed and listed there? Because I was looking at them, I didn't see you in them, but I saw like certain people that were giving statements.
Well, here's what I tried to do with some of those cases on my website. I tried to put documentation on there, like court orders and things like that, where people could go and read for themselves when I say in my book that the judge said this or the judge said that. They could go and actually see the court order themselves. They didn't have to, again, they didn't have to take my word for it. Okay. I think that's very, very important when somebody does an investigation that they don't just walk around making conclusions and basically in the end is saying, well, Sam Peroni says this is what happened. Um, I didn't want to write the book like that because number one, who cares what Sam Peroni believes? But what I did want to do was I did want to lay out the evidence so that people could decide for themselves. And this stuff that you're talking about when it comes to the mob and Peter Pitches and Frank Sinatra and all of that that's in my book, that was put in there purely to show everyone how the 1981 investigation was superficial and how it was intended to be superficial. All right. It wasn't an accident. They wanted to gloss over things and move on so that this didn't cast any aspersions over on Robert Wagner or on other people that were alive. All right. That were involved in an industry that was involved with the mob and very powerful people. Let me also say this about Dr. Noguchi. Even though I'm very critical of him in my book and very critical on this program, I'm not saying that Dr. Noguchi wasn't a smart man and a good pathologist. I think in some of the cases, and I think in RFK's case, Robert Kennedy's case, I think he did do a good job. Right? It's just that Noguchi was was the kind of guy who would get something in his mind, and then he just did everything to make it come out the way he wanted it to come out. And I think what he wanted was he wanted it to be over with fast. They did an autopsy. He wanted to say, we did an autopsy and it's an accident. That's the end of it. So that everybody would move on. And again, no aspersions would be cast on anyone, particularly those involved in the Hollywood film and TV business.
Mr. Peroni, is there a place where people can find your links? You've given me enough of your time to be able to have another discussion on Natalie Wood, and I'm very appreciative of the time you've given me for this conversation and the many others that we have done in the past. But is there a place where people can find your links? And also, can you mention one more time where people can find the video that you had put up with the interview of, you said Marilyn Wayne, right?
Yes, I'll be happy to. First of all, if you want to purchase my book, you can go to Amazon, of course. You can also go to Barnes and Noble, the websites. You can obtain a hardback book that way. If you want a paperback book, you go to my website, which is nataliewoodbrainstorm.com. And we have very nice paperbacks that we can ship to you if you'd like to buy one of those. Marilyn Wayne's interview that I conducted is on YouTube. So just go and punch in Marilyn Wayne and it'll pop up there and you can watch her answer questions that I propound to her during our video deposition. There are also, on my website, again, there are also many documents. There's portions of deposition testimony on there, pleadings that I filed in the cases, to show you the depth at which I went to try to obtain information in Natalie Wood's death, and how much effort I had to put into it. I mean, I spent hundreds of hours fighting with the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department and the coroner's office over records. The last thing that people can do is this. And if anyone thinks that I'm finished with Natalie Wood's investigation or getting justice for Natalie Wood, they are sorely mistaken. I have been making a concerted effort for the last 3 years to get the Los Angeles County Sheriff's, to get the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office to conduct a public inquest of Natalie Wood's death. It's too late to prosecute anyone. If somebody wanted to prosecute Robert Wagner, he's over 95 years old, and I think in poor health. I mean, it would be impossible because a lot of witnesses have died and that kind of thing. But a coroner's inquest is different. They don't have the rules of evidence in a coroner's inquest, so people can introduce things like, for instance, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department notes, the investigator notes. Those would be admissible in a coroner's inquest. And a coroner's inquest can be in front of a jury, too, by the way. So you can have a jury of people, citizens of Los Angeles County, look at this to determine whether or not they conclude that Natalie's death was a homicide. That is, that somebody killed her. They don't find that it's a murder or a manslaughter or anything else like that, just whether or not it was a homicide. Because right now, her autopsy report and death certificate basically claims it is unexplained, that she drowned and nobody knows what happened. Well, that's not true. And I'm trying to get the DA in Los Angeles to ask the coroner to hold an inquest. So if you want to help in that regard, you go to change.org and you can sign a petition along with almost 2,500 people that have signed the petition for a coroner's inquest. And I'm going to keep working on that petition until I get 10,000 signatures. And I keep sending letters to the district attorney's office, asking them to write a simple letter to the coroner and say, we want you to hold an inquest. That's all the DA has to do. And yet, so far, after 3 years and 2 district attorneys, I can't get anybody to respond to my letters.
Well, I appreciate the work you've done, Mr. Peroni. And anyone listening out there, the link to the petition will be in this episode description. So just click on that. It takes a couple seconds to sign it. It's not a big deal. And then look, you can say you helped out with the Natalie Wood investigation or reopening of the case. I appreciate the time, Mr. Peroni. I'm going to have all your links in the description. And thank you, everybody, for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank. Stay tuned for our next episode.